Hi there, I'm Emily Muehlstein with the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council, and this is a public hearing video on Reef Fish Amendment 51, which considers the gray snapper status determination criteria and annual catch limits. So gray snapper are also referred to as either mangrove snapper or mangoes, and federally they have no sector allocation between commercial and recreational fishing sectors. They have a 12-inch minimum size limit, and there is a 10 per person limit within the 10 snapper aggregate. A couple of interesting things about the biology of the species. It takes about 4 years for them to grow big enough for us to keep. They max out at about 28 years of age, and they typically spawn throughout the summer months. So that brings us to why we're here. In 2018, the first ever stock assessment of gray snapper was completed, and that was CDAR 51. The terminal year of data that was used in that assessment was 2015, and basically what that assessment showed was that the stock is likely fully exploited, and it has actually experienced overfishing several times since the early 1980s. So after that stock assessment was complete, the Council's scientific advisors, the Scientific and Statistical Committee, which I'm going to refer to as the SSC, didn't determine whether or not gray snapper is overfished because we do not have what's called status determination criteria set for gray snapper. Now we'll get into what the status determination criteria is a little bit later. Basically, it is the values that are set to determine whether a stock is either overfished or undergoing overfishing. And this helps us figure out what we can harvest in future years. Now, National Standard 1 of the Magnuson-Stevens Act says that a reef fish fishery management plan requires that each species has status determination criteria set. So the Council in this amendment is looking at setting those criteria, including the maximum sustainable yield proxy, the maximum fishing mortality threshold, the minimum stock size threshold, and the optimum yield. And don't worry, we'll get into the meaning of each one of those individual status determination criteria as we get further along. Additionally, using the existing maximum fishing mortality threshold, the SSC determined that the stock is indeed experiencing overfishing. So the Council is actually considering modifying that maximum fishing mortality threshold and catch levels in this amendment. And finally, based on that assessment, the SSC recommended new catch levels for 2019 through 2021. Now they did this using 3 different maximum sustainable yield proxy alternatives, and the Council will have to select annual catch limits consistent with those recommendations. Okay, so we'll jump right in and start addressing these different status determination criteria one by one. So we'll start with Action 1, which looks at the maximum sustainable yield proxy, or MSY. And that MSY is defined as the largest long-term average catch or yield that can be taken from a stock or stock complex each year on a continuing basis under prevailing conditions, meaning the ecological, environmental, or fishery characteristic type conditions. Now, since the MSY can rarely be calculated with accuracy, we often use a proxy. In this case, we use what's called the spawning potential ratio, which is the size of the spawning stock relative to what the size of the spawning stock would be in the absence of fishing mortality. Now that value is selected to maximize the productivity of the stock. So in the case of gray snapper, the stock assessment did not produce an MSY estimate. The MSY proxy is not currently defined for gray snapper either. And so the Council actually considered 3 different MSY proxies. Fishing mortality at 26% spawning potential ratio, 30% spawning potential ratio, and then 40% spawning potential ratio. And they suggested that the MSY proxy for gray snapper be set at F30% SPR. So the important thing to remember here for MSY is that lower MSY proxy values are actually associated with higher yield or harvest for the species. However, if you have a higher MSY proxy value, then the stock is more resilient to natural variability before it is considered to be overfished. So our first alternative here is the no action alternative, and that would not set an MSY value for gray snapper. Our second alternative, which is the Council's preferred alternative, is actually the most aggressive as far as yield is concerned, and that would set the MSY proxy at F26% SPR. Alternative 3, which is what the Council's SSC recommended, would set the MSY proxy at F30% SPR, and then alternative 4 would set the most conservative value as far as harvest is concerned at F40% SPR. And finally, alternative 5, which is also a preferred alternative for the Council, is that for future assessments of gray snapper, the MSY proxy would equal the yield produced by FMSY or proxy recommended by the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council's Scientific and Statistical Committee, and subject to approval by the Council through a plan amendment. Okay, so now we'll move on to the maximum fishing mortality threshold, or the MFMT. So the MFMT is the rate of fishing mortality above which a stock is considered to be experiencing overfishing, meaning that fish are being removed from the stock at too rapid of a rate. And it is important to note that that MFMT cannot exceed the fishing mortality at maximum sustainable yield. So the current definition of the gray snapper MFMT is set at fishing mortality at 30% SPR. It's important to note here that the lower the MSY proxy, the higher the MFMT can be. This assumes that fewer fish are required to produce the spawning output needed to achieve that maximum sustainable yield. So our first alternative is the no action alternative, and that would leave the MFMT at F30% SPR. Our second alternative, which is the Council's preferred alternative, would set the MFMT equal to F26% SPR, so that would align with the current preferred alternative for maximum sustainable yield, which again is sort of the most aggressive as far as harvest is concerned. And then finally, the third alternative would set the gray snapper MFMT at F40% SPR. Next, we move to action 3, which considers the minimum stock size threshold, or the MSST. So the MSST is the biomass level that a stock can decline to before being declared overfished. And once that stock is overfished, it does require a rebuilding plan. It's important to note here that the MSST can be no lower than 50% of the biomass at maximum sustainable yield. So for gray snapper, the MSST is currently undefined. It's important to note here that as the MSST value increases, a higher biomass is required for the stock to not be considered overfished. As the MSST value decreases, a lower biomass is allowed. However, in this scenario, if the stock does enter overfish condition, then it's much harder to rebuild. So again, our first alternative is the no action alternative, and that would not define an MSST for gray snapper. Alternative 2 would set the MSST at 85% of BMSY. Alternative 3 would set the MSST at 75% of BMSY. And then alternative 4, which is the Council's current preferred, would set the MSST at 50% of BMSY. So this alternative does allow the stock biomass to be smaller before it's declared overfished. However, if we do enter an overfish condition, then it will take longer or be harder for us to rebuild. And next we move on to optimum yield, or OY, which is the level of harvest that will provide the greatest overall benefit to the nation, and it's based on the maximum sustainable yield reduced by any relevant economic or social or ecological factors. So currently for gray snapper, the OY is undefined. And it's important to note here that the allowable harvest increases the closer OY is set to maximum sustainable yield. Alternative 1 is our no action alternative, so that would not define an OY for gray snapper. So preferred alternative 2 would set an OY for gray snapper, And we have some sub-options here. Option 2A would set the OY at 50% of the fishing mortality at maximum sustainable yield. Option 2B would set the OY at 75% of the fishing mortality at MSY. And finally, option C, which is the council's preferred alternative, would set the OY at 90% of the fishing mortality at OY. So again, this option allows for the greatest amount of harvest because we are setting the OY as close to MSY as possible. And finally, action 5 looks at setting our annual catch limits for gray snapper. So the overfishing limit and the acceptable biological catch yield streams depend upon the maximum sustainable yield value, which we selected in action 1. You'll notice that a lot of alternatives have actually used that MSY as their basis. So the catch levels can also be further modified to account for management uncertainty. Now you'll see our current catch limits for gray snapper in millions of pounds whole weight. Sort of the important one to look at here is the annual catch limit, which is set at 2.42 million pounds currently. So our first alternative is the no action alternative, and that would leave our annual catch limits as they are. You should note that all the remaining alternatives actually remove an annual catch target and only deal with an annual catch limit. So alternative 2, which is the council's current preferred alternative, would use the yield stream that is associated with the MSY proxy of F26% SPR. Now we have two sub-options here. We could simply set the annual catch limit equal to the acceptable biological catch, or we could look at option 2B, which is the council's current preferred alternative, and that would use the council's ACL-ACT control rule to establish an 11% buffer between the ABC and the ACL. And you can see the resulting annual catch limits in this table. And it's important to note that this is actually one of the more aggressive alternatives that allows for the most harvest. Alternative 3 would use the yield stream associated with the MSY proxy of F30% SPR. And you can see here the sub-option 3A is if we set ACL equal to ABC, and then sub-option 3B if we use the council's control rule to establish that 11% buffer. And these are the harvest values associated with both of those options. And finally, alternative 4 uses the yield stream associated with the MSY proxy of F40% SPR, and we have the same sub-options here. Sub-option A, we could set ACL equal to ABC, or sub-option B, we could use the council's ACL-ACT control rule to establish that 11% buffer between the ABC and the ACL. So that is a summary of the actions and alternatives being considered in this document. Now, please don't take for granted how complicated this status determination criteria stuff is. Truthfully, I work here and I still have to think really hard about it every time I look at it. So you are always welcome to contact us with questions at golfcouncil@golfcouncil.org. Now, we would love it if you would send us your comments before we take final action on this document in August. You can either do that by submitting your comments online by following this link, or you can email us at golfcouncil@golfcouncil.org. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and send us your thoughts.